tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So I maybe cheekily titled the little note that I announced this talk with. I think it was like, you should want to be free. I'm thinking a little bit about how the Buddha talked about liberation, nibbana, the end of the path, and how the ideal of liberation for some of us not only can seem quite distant, but might even seem undesirable. And I've heard many folks, students of various kinds, say as much. And I've felt aspects of that myself. You know, if I feel into how the Buddha in the earliest layer of the teachings describes the person who is liberated, particularly in some of the very earliest layers of the teachings, like the poems that you find in the Sutta Nipata, which is one of the oldest layers of the Pali Canon. You find these songs essentially that praise, essentially the person who has turned their back on the world, who in one of them, that the rhinoceros horn song or sutta discourse, it's a whole series of verses that praise one who lives and travels alone, like a rhinoceros horn, and a lot of us suspect that the translation is just like nobody quite knows what the rhinoceros horn is referring to. Is it literally the horn of the rhinoceros, or is it a mistranslation for another kind of archetype of solitary power that the Buddha often used to describe himself, which was the bull elephant, which might make more sense if you understand that the bull elephant, that Indian bull elephants often will leave the herd and go wandering off by themselves. And so the Buddha would use that as a metaphor for himself. But there's the sense in the earliest layer of the texts that the letting go of the constriction of the poisons, what are called the fetters, the 10, constrictions of the heart, like personality view, like thinking you're really somebody, or the constriction of, really the constrictions of all of the main hindrances of sensual desire, of hatred, of restlessness and dullness, and all of those, doubt, skeptical doubt. That the letting go of all these turns one into a person who's really not bound by anything, not bound by social roles, not bound by responsibilities, perhaps in a practical way, but certainly as a social intervention, the thing the Buddha invented to help people to realize this ideal of being, deeply unbound, emotionally, cognitively free, was the monastic sangha, a way for both men and women to live communally with very, very low material needs, such that they could be supported entirely on the generosity of gifts, and live a very simple life outside of the urban centers. So all of the early monasteries were, technically in the wilderness, but that's not wilderness the way we think of it. They weren't like deep on a mountain in Yosemite or something, 100 miles from a town. Wilderness probably meant like a nicely cultivated park on the edge of a small city. So, some of you are in urban centers like the East Bay of California, in Berkeley. This would essentially mean like living in like Tilden Park, where you could easily walk downtown, get your meal for the day, and then walk back to the woods and where you lived. Right. Remember that the monastics have to walk to town every single day for their meal. They cannot store food overnight. And so there's no possibility in the system that the Buddha originally created for someone to like store up a bunch of food or get a big donation from a wealthy landowner or something, and then go off to a cave in the forest and not come out for 10 years, stay in utter solitude. It would be impossible to do that. You would have to, at the very least, have a lay person with you as an attendant who would run a kitchen and store the food, and they would technically own everything, because monastics are prohibited by the Vinaya from storing food overnight. And this, these rules created a system where there were really two kinds of people. There were monastics who would practice the path by really setting aside most of their material and relational obligations in the ordinary world, certainly setting aside being immersed in family and business and politics and commerce. And in exchange, they would hold down, in a sense, the spiritual ground. They would be the teachers and mentors and guides and inspirational figures for a community of lay people who would come together to support communities of monastics. And I think it's most valuable, it's been most valuable for me to think of them not as two separate ways of living. Like there's the monastics over here and they're really separate from the world, and then there's the whole world, which is busy and complex. But since the monastics cannot exist without an equally powerful lay sangha that's devoted to them, because it takes a fair number of people to support a bunch of monastics. What you have then is an integrated society within the Buddhist sphere, let's say, where some people who are devoted to family and commerce and sensual pleasures decide that they have enough material wealth to support a bunch of other people. It's sort of like you could be a wealthy layperson and decide that you have enough material wealth to support a very big family. And part of that big family is a whole bunch of monastics. And so in the same way that I don't mind paying all of the expenses for my kid, sometimes I mind, it's built in, right? Why would it be a terrible thing for me to decide that I have enough wealth to support, a couple people who I respect greatly and who have to behave in a way that they maintain my respect, but that I respect greatly, in order to, preserve a tradition and live a beautiful spiritual life, and then teach and really be a light in the world. So the Buddhist idea is that you have this group of people, X number of people. Some of them become monastics of various kinds. Some become teachers. Some of them become more like hermits. Some of them become educators who teach children. Remember that the early monasteries were also schools. So they're not just hiding away meditating, but they're teaching everybody's kids, and teaching all the adults, practice. And then there's a bunch of people who make money. And the folks who make money have families, and they enjoy the sensual pleasures side of things. And together, that collective of people is the Sangha. It's called the Fourfold Sangha, for men and women monastics and men and women lay people. And it's appropriate now to understand it as the, fourfold can feel reductive to trans folks because it affirms a gendered binary. So we can say, folks of any, anywhere in the field of gender participating in one of these two ways of being in community, being on the monastic side or the lay side of things. And so within this social arrangement, the ideal of liberation or enlightenment is that something becomes possible when one can devote one's full, all day, every day energy to letting go of the ancient patterns of constriction that bind the heart. And I think what the Buddha realized that led to his, the Buddha wasn't the one that realized that going off into the wilderness was helpful for unbinding the heart. There was a long tradition of doing so that he just joined. So he didn't renounce his family and his wealth because his realization was, uniquely valuing of renunciation. He didn't realize, oh, you have to do that in order to become free. He did it first because it's just what you did. He joined a tradition of renunciates, said, oh, if you want to seek for truth, you set down the burdens and the binding relationships of family and commerce and business and lay community, and you set down the devotion to sensual pleasures that bound you to that life, and you go and live in the wilderness in a very simple kind of ascetic way. So there was a long tradition of doing that. I'm not actually sure how long. It probably means at least a few hundred years, probably going way back into the indigenous times, much, much longer. But in terms of texts, the tradition that we think of as the tradition that the Buddha joined, which is the Samana or Shramana tradition, probably started, maybe a few hundred years before his time. So somewhere in the 800 to 1,000 years before the Common Era sort of time. This is when the earliest Upanishads were written, where we have record of these people leaving the cities, going into the wilderness, meditating, fasting, doing various practices. So the Buddha joins that crew, and so he does the renunciation first, and then he does a bunch of different kinds of practices, eventually finds a liberation that is not particularly ascetic by the qualities of his time, but also he doesn't return to the lay life. So when he becomes enlightened, he doesn't say, oh, enlightenment is just letting go in whatever circumstance you're in. I'm going to go back to my family and just be released and just live in that world. He doesn't do that. I think he realizes that there is something supportive, tremendously supportive, about the communal life that he had found in the forest with the other ascetics. And so he founds a new monastic order. And he doesn't just found, yet another one of many monastic orders that were present at the time. It begins like that, but his partly survives to the modern day because it's one of the most structured, most well organized of them. They preserved their texts, they preserved their monastic regulations, they preserved the lineage. There was a lot of labor went into making this a very strong system, the monastic system, and a lot of lay support went into it. So the Buddha realizes that there's something supportive about deep material renunciation that was really helpful for the liberation that he had found. And the practices that he found that lead to this liberation center on the meditative states known as jhana, the deep absorbed states of stillness and profound relaxation and inner silence, inner stillness, that turn out to be very pleasurable and nourishing and extraordinarily fulfilling. And part of what part of what I imagine, what I put together, since like with that as his main meditation instruction, and deep letting go as his main wisdom instruction, and material renunciation as his main like physical relational instruction, it seems like, well, those three things really work together. The physical renunciation of wealth and family and immersion in the urban, sensual, relational environment, setting that aside and living in a much more simple way, particularly sheltered from sexuality and commerce, that those things are conducive to the mind getting really still and content. What are the two things that obsess the heart and mind so much for modern folks? Really, not even just modern. You see it in the most ancient texts, that these were the things that people obsess about, and it's sex and money, right? It's sensual relationship with others in all of its form, not just sex, but everything in the relationship and marriage and intimacy and sensuality realm. And then there's money and power and wealth and comforts and everything in that realm. And those two things together create most cultures, interwoven with the beautiful aspects of both of those, the way that the eros of sensual life expresses as art and music and the beautiful glories of cultures that are all over the world. Every culture has art, music, dancing, singing. These are expressions of eros, we'll say, of the delight in sensual existence, the delight in aliveness. And he realizes that despite all of the beauties of these things, and he had experienced the beauties, he describes parties with extraordinary musicians and wonderful food and good friends and all of this, and of course a lovely wife and child when he was young, and realizing that all of these things would not be ultimately satisfying. In the way that he was seeking a peace of mind that could be vast enough to comfort the heart in the face of inevitable death and loss. So, as you know well, if you've been around, and you all have, the Dharma, there's nothing in it that says that life is terrible. What the Buddha realizes is that no matter how good life is, loss of those you love and then death of your own body is inevitable. The loss of everything you love is inevitable. And what do you do with that? How do you deal with that? It doesn't matter how extraordinary the beauties and eros of life is. There's still something that haunts the heart about the reality of old age, sickness, and death. And so he sets out to find a solution to this, and the solution he finds depends on this profound renunciation. And part of what I love about this conception is that it's not just a philosophical recognition that deep letting go is going to lead to peacefulness, but there's the recognition throughout the teachings, but also throughout the structure that he created, that to accomplish this deep letting go, you need several things to be in place, and one of those is a supportive community, because you can't actually let go of, no one actually lets go of commerce. What you do is you outsource it to lay people. So the lay people who still enjoy wealth, and the pleasures of the senses that can be bought with money, those folks agree to take on the burden and the suffering and the stress of dealing with money in order to support some people to have to not do that, to be able to not do that. That's what dana is. Dana is not the giving of money to the teacher or to the monastic. Dana is the gift of time to practice and to deepen. It's the gift of not having to hustle for your livelihood. That's dana, you know. And in that sense, dana for monastics is radically different from dana for a teacher like myself, who's a lay person and I support a family. And, you know, I offer these teachings freely on dana because I believe in that part of the system, but I'm not a renunciate in that way. And so when you give me dana, what you're doing is you're making it possible for me to devote some of my time to teaching, where I devote a lot of it to my day job that actually just pays me a salary. You know, and for some teachers, like, and it is actually true in a certain way. You know, here's the math for you. The more dana you give, the more teaching I can do. If you give enough dana, I can quit my day job and teach a lot, right? I'm not asking for that. You know, if you are that donor, call me. But with lay people, it's a really different thing. You know, it's kind of microscopic. You know, you give a bit more dana, maybe I get to reduce my hours slightly, teach a little more, do a retreat. But with monastics, it gets to be this beautiful, much cleaner kind of absolute thing. It's like, oh, they're making the commitment to live the life of Dharma fully. And then what the lay people do is we say, we will support you to do that. And we're going to commit to supporting you to do that, you know. And then the monastic gets to say, like, you know, with gratitude for that support, I'm going to try to do this thing that is very difficult to do, which is to let go fully. To let go of all expectations, to let go of all responsibility, to really unbind the heart completely from identity, from grasping, from fear. And they can only really do that, most people can only really do that when something like the material realm is taken care of. Because you can become relatively free as a layperson. And in the Pali Canon, there are a few lay people who become very enlightened, who master jhana, get very liberated. And there are some modern lay teachers who become, and practitioners, who have become very, very free. There's an old kind of proposal in the commentaries to the canon that when a person becomes at least a non-returner, there's 4 levels of enlightenment. There's stream entry, once return, non-return, and arahant, or perfection. That if someone becomes a non-returner, and that means that you've fully released the first 3 fetters. The biggest one is personality view, thinking that you actually exist as an independent, separate, you know, identity-defined being. And then you've really weakened, you know, grasping and hatred. Once you do that, it says it's actually really hard to stay being a layperson, because your motivation for making money and pursuing sensual pleasures has so deeply been worn away. You've let go of so much that it's actually fairly difficult to stay motivated. You just want to go and be a monastic, if that's available to you. And maybe it's not, and you have a family to feed. And so, you know, I think that's sort of the best case scenario for modern practitioners, is like, it's not actually easy to go be a monastic in the West. There's not that many places. There are a few. But also, like, I'm not going to go be a monk right now. I'm going to feed my family. So then my best case scenario is that I become so profoundly free that I just do my work with no anxiety and no stress and no fear, no worry that I'm going to lose something. And that what happens as a result of dropping away from all those anxieties and fears is that I do my work efficiently and well. You know, how well would I work if I lost all of the like anxiety that haunts me through my workday? If I lost all fear of failure and, you know, and like lost procrastination and lost energetic dullness, you know, rested for a little while in jhana every morning, nourishing the heart mind, I might be an extraordinary worker. You know, I might be way more productive than I am now. This is a very capitalist way to talk about liberation. And and just in case you thought that was, a a desirable sounding thing, there is a new tech startup, right? A bunch of young guys from Silicon Valley who discovered jhana on retreat with a couple of insight teachers, Lee Brasington among them, and they have a venture capital funded startup called Journey with an H, for like JHANA is jhana. Their Journey. And their goal is to get as many people into jhana as possible because it's profoundly nourishing and really, really super healthy, which it is. And so they've got a little startup that's like, we're gonna optimize this process to get people into these states, as fast as possible for their health and well-being. And no, it's a little bit facepalm. I totally agree. Because they're a bunch of tech bros. Right. Thank you, Andrea. Because capitalism can eat anything. It's true. It's absolutely true. And the thing that they're developing is an EEG headset that's going to give you the most refined biofeedback so that you can learn to enter jhana more quickly. Other than the fact that it kind of smells of the tech bro kind of capitalist world, it's not that I'm not in favor of that. Like, I want people to get into jhana everywhere. I think it's profoundly healthy and in a certain way anti-capitalist, because if you experience the profound nourishment of those states, the natural result and the intended result in the Dharma is that you stop wanting to buy stuff because they're better than anything. And so, so maybe the Western lay goal is like you deal with your mind enough that like in the morning you rest in profound meditative states for a little while, and then your energy is so clear that you do your job without anxiety, and you do it so well that you duck out at 3:00, and you spend the afternoon with your kids. Like, I'm down for this. I like this idea. But I think the cruel reality in a certain way, speaking of capitalism, is that the system that many of us live in as lay people is in so many ways so unhealthy and conducive to anxiety and stress and distress that it may seem, and it seems to some people, like not only is profound liberation completely out of reach, but actually even the smallest steps toward freedom, like just a little bit of self-compassion and dealing with my anxious, fearful mind, that's an accomplishment in the Dharma, right? And this is no small thing, to recognize that the conditions that we live under are not only not monastic, like nobody is paying you to spend your day meditating and sweeping the paths and educating the children and chanting at 8 p.m. and in general letting your mind settle into the radiant rapture and bliss of deliverance. Not only is that not happening, but you're not even, in like a stable job that you could just rely on, where you could do something for your soul every morning and evening in a non-anxious way, And that change is quite recent. It's older depending on what culture you live in and what socioeconomic class you live in. But like I came from relatively privileged middle-class folk here in California. Not wealthy middle class. My dad had a government job, but he got that job in 1972. Like, I was 1 year old. They moved out here he was in grad school. He got his PhD. He moved out here with a 1-year-old baby that they had just adopted. He took a job at a government lab and he kept it for the rest of his life. So one job, one house. They bought their house in a California suburb for $25,000 in 1972 and never moved. And he died in that house last year. So, I've lived in 15 houses. I might never own one. everything is uncertain. There's anxiety about everything, for everybody I know in my generation. And so what do we do if the material conditions around us, I guess this is really turning into like the socialist critique of capitalism from the Buddhist socialism says why capitalism will keep you from becoming enlightened. I think this is true. What do we do when we recognize that the material conditions around us are largely not conducive to the kind of heart-mind release that the teachings point toward? But we might love the Dharma and really be drawn to the teachings on deep release. And I think the contemporary solution, the solution that's the most common, and I critique this, but I actually don't, so I want you to hear both sides, is that the thing that's available to us is a kind of, emotional intelligence, relational intelligence, somatic intelligence, and, a kind of somatic psychological healing. That some amount of letting go is really possible through mindfulness, through loving kindness, through right relationship with the world, and that a great deal of freedom can come in that. That just coming to terms with, just being real about the world in the era of climate crisis. Crisis is too small a word for it at this point. In the era of climate apocalypse, which might be too strong a word, somewhere in between crisis and apocalypse, find your own word. In an era of profound, geopolitical instability, what do you do? If you're drawn to liberation and you recognize that the requirement for liberation in a certain way is that you have to be able to find the pathway to the heart-mind, setting down anxiety, setting down fear, and setting down the obsessions that haunt us. A few people do find their way to monastery, and almost some of them, I know some people who found their way to it, hung out in it for a decade or two, and then were like, this isn't for me. And they came back out to the world and they were like, whoa, this is crazy. Now I'm back. What do I do? What do I do about sex and money and all the things? But I know quite a number of people who found their way to it and are so grateful that they found it, are just some of the happiest people I know of, who were like, yeah, it's a trade-off, and what a trade-off, But I've lived with these beautiful friends for 50 years, well cared for, able to pursue the depths of peace that are possible, and to share that with the whole community around, to be in deep relationship with a community of lay people who are beautiful friends. So I know a few people who have found that, and that is available to you if you want that. But most of us are not in that, and so we find ourselves confronted with this teaching. And I don't know if you feel confronted, but I sometimes feel confronted with a teaching that I think proposes that that this thing is possible, and that it takes a fair amount of sheltering the mind to get there. And what do I do with that? Because in the ancient world, in the early Buddhist world, it wasn't assumed that lay people were trying to become liberated. In a coherent Buddhist society, if anyone could become a monastic whenever they wanted, it was kind of assumed that if you're still a layperson, that's where you want to be. You want to be immersed in family and commerce. And so you do that, and you practice, and you want to be liberated. But if you wanted to devote all of your time, if you wanted to be a full-time seeker of liberation, it's easy, right? You just set down your responsibilities and you go join, you cross the line. You go to the side of the community where people have the time to do that. And the price of doing that, is a little bit steep. The steepest of the prices is the renunciation of family for many folks. And so, so there's a comment in the chat that is very much, I can't tell if it's, maybe it was directly just to me, but that's fine. I'll read it. Can't you feel, or what about feeling something like fear and anxiety arising and being with those emotions equanimously? So it's not a zero-sum thing, like not completely either or, but rather both and. I kind of have a yes and for that. That is, I think, the modern ideal. And it's the contemporary lay practitioner ideal, I think partly because that's one of the best things we can do. It's actually relatively difficult to fully uproot fear and anxiety within the material conditions of our lives. I'm just afraid for my family's safety and well-being in the world. And some amount of that is just like a natural, authentic response to the conditions I find myself in. It's like, well, yeah, I don't have that 50-year-long job that was secure. I don't know what security feels like, materially speaking. So there's some amount of anxiety and fear with that I think is just built into the system. And so I think the best I can do is to learn how to process those emotions in a healthy way, to receive them with some equanimity, to get support when I need, and to not let them be my master. So yes to that. And I don't find anywhere in the Buddha's original teachings the instruction to just be equanimous with any of the unwholesome states, fear or anxiety, or any of the others, but very much the opposite. The instruction is to meet them skillfully, such that they diminish and disappear and are prevented from arising. So I don't find an instruction to be equanimous with difficult emotions, painful emotions, in the early texts. I find that instruction arising in the modern period, and I think partly because that's a good instruction for us. If you can't, if you can't beat them, join them. Like if you can't dispel the demons from your house, at least live with them in a healthy way. Like, I'm okay with that. But that's not, I don't think that's what the Buddha originally was proposing. And partly why I'm talking about it in this way is that I want you to know that it's not actually easy to reconcile what might be healthy and appropriate for us with what's in the earliest texts, right? You can't just in a facile way say, well, the Buddha meant that because that's what we think is healthy for us. I think it's appropriate to say that it's actually rather difficult to fit all of the teachings from a Bronze Age renunciate monastic ascetic teacher in the wilderness of the plain of the Ganges, in the pre-empire period of India, to our modern condition under late capitalism in the globally interconnected world. There's no promise that an ancient philosophy actually still works. We propose that it does because it's brilliant, and we can tell that some parts of it really still work. But that doesn't mean that all parts of it work. I'll close by saying that in the texts, the Buddha does say that one of the signs that the Dhamma is disappearing from the world is that respect for concentration and jhana begins to disappear. And remember that the thing that jhana requires is the deep stillness and relaxing of the mind. So when we stop respecting the states of deep samadhi, we will stop creating the conditions for those states to arise. And the condition for those states to arise is material stability for some people. And so non-anxious livelihood, we could say, and even if very, very simple, right? Non-anxious livelihood. And so if we as a culture are unable to or unwilling to create situations of non-anxious livelihood, we will be unable to create the conditions for reliable jhana and samadhi and meditative contentment for our practitioners. And if we want to believe that line in the ancient texts, we might understand that this is a sign of the inevitable diminishing of the Dhamma in the world, that it can't survive if we no longer can make the conditions for some people to become profoundly released through the subtle practices required. And maybe that's, we know the decline of the Dhamma is inevitable, so there's no need to wail and gnash our teeth, but it's also, the timing is not inevitable. And there definitely are people around who can do these practices. There are still monastics who devote their lives in that way. And I think that there's still the possibility in the world for some of us privileged enough to have some non-anxiety in our lives, even amid the global, dumpster fire, to remain devoted to inner peace, despite, everything, and to accept some of the trade-offs, perhaps in reduced productivity or whatever capitalism doesn't want you to do. Use the privilege that you have to take an hour in the morning, or to go on retreat, or to, not increase your busyness if you don't have to, in order to make space for the mind to deepen in the path in the way that our teacher, our ancient teacher, instructed, and that perhaps is still possible in this world for a little while yet, and only if we, every generation, lean into it, and some people really do it fully. So, all right, we'll pause there. Thank you for your warm listening and considering of this realm.